rock and roll singer Rick Nelson was killed last night in a private plane crash in Texas. Officials say that his chartered DC-3 caught fire in flight and crashed while trying to make an emergency landing.
Rick Nelson and 5 band members on their way to a Dallas hotel for a New Year's Eve concert, all killed. The chartered Douglas DC-3 reportedly caught fire in midair. The pilot tried first to land the plane on a road.
On the night of December 31st, 1985, as fireworks prepared to light the skies across America, a different kind of fire was already burning high above Texas. It wasn't celebration, it was disaster. A private aircraft, traveling through darkness, suddenly erupted into flames before crashing to the ground. When the wreckage cooled, the nation learned that Ricky Nelson was dead. He was only 45 years old. The news landed like a cruel echo of a familiar story. Another musician gone too soon. Another tragic ending, tied to fame, pressure, and excess. The headlines moved quickly. The explanations felt rehearsed. Mechanical failure, pilot error, a possible fire on board. Within days, the story was effectively closed. But for those who knew Ricky Nelson's journey, something never quite added up. Ricky Nelson wasn't just a singer. He wasn't just an actor. He was something far rarer. Someone Americans felt they knew. He had grown up in their homes, aged alongside their children, and carried a carefully maintained image of reliability and professionalism. His sudden death, and the speed with which blame settled around it, raised quiet questions that lingered long after the cameras moved on. For decades, the public explanation went unchallenged. But now, with long-buried evidence resurfacing and overlooked details finally examined, a far darker truth has emerged. One that doesn't point to recklessness or bad luck, but to negligence, silence, and decisions that should never have been made. To understand why Ricky Nelson's death matters so much today, we must first understand who he was and what he represented. From the early 1950s onward, Ricky Nelson wasn't just famous, he was part of America's routine. On the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, audiences didn't watch a fictional family played by actors. They watched a real family playing softened versions of themselves. Week after week, the Nelsons welcomed millions into their living room, offering an idealized vision of American life. Ricky grew up on screen. From childhood innocence to teenage curiosity, viewers watched his real voice change, his posture shift, his confidence form. That level of familiarity was unprecedented. He wasn't admired from a distance. He was trusted. Ricky was America's son, explains pop culture historian Dr. Margaret Chen. He embodied stability at a time when the country desperately wanted to believe in it. That image made what happened in 1957 all the more remarkable. At 16, Ricky asked to do something unexpected. He wanted to sing a rock and roll song on the show, a Fats Domino track called I'm Walkin'. At the time, rock music still scared parents. It was loud, rebellious, and unpredictable. But Ricky wasn't. When the episode aired, something changed. Letters flooded the studio. Teenage girls demanded records. Parents didn't object. They already trusted him. Within weeks, Ricky Nelson was no longer just a sitcom star. He was a legitimate recording artist. Between 1957 and 1962, Ricky Nelson placed 30 songs in the top 40. Only Elvis Presley and Pat Boone matched or exceeded that level of success during the same period. Songs like Poor Little Fool, Hello Mary Lou, Lonesome Town, and Travelin' Man weren't aggressive or provocative. They were smooth, emotional, and controlled. Music historian Alan Parker explains why Ricky mattered so much. Elvis broke barriers. Ricky normalized them. He made rock and roll acceptable inside middle-class homes. Behind the scenes, Ricky was far more serious than his clean image suggested. He insisted on recording with his touring band rather than anonymous studio musicians, a radical demand at the time. He surrounded himself with elite talent, including guitarist James Burton, whose influence would later extend to Elvis Presley himself. Unlike many teen idols, Ricky wasn't controlled by handlers. He demanded creative input. He chose his songs. He shaped his sound. He was an artist first, even when the industry wanted him to be a product. By the early 1960s, Ricky Nelson occupied a rare position. He had survived child stardom without scandal, built musical credibility, and earned respect from his peers. But the industry around him was changing fast. The British invasion arrived. The Beatles transformed expectations. Rock grew louder, heavier, and more experimental. Ricky's smooth rockabilly sound suddenly felt out of step with the times. Radio stations moved on. Record labels chased the next revolution. Ricky adapted, but quietly. He continued touring, continued recording, continued working. What he didn't do was disappear, and that's where the story begins to darken. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Ricky Nelson was no longer at the center of the spotlight, but he was far from washed up. He performed constantly, often flying between small venues and casinos, keeping his band employed and his career alive. He wasn't chasing fame. He was sustaining a living. But sustaining that life came with pressure. Private aircraft became a necessity, not a luxury. Tight schedules, long distances, limited budgets. The plane Ricky was using in late 1985 wasn't new, it wasn't state-of-the-art, and it wasn't without known problems. On December 31st, Ricky boarded a Douglas DC-3 aircraft with his band, heading to a New Year's Eve performance in Dallas. The flight never made it. Shortly after takeoff, a fire broke out on board. The plane went down in a field near DeKalb, Texas. All 7 people on board were killed instantly. Within hours, speculation took over. Anonymous sources whispered about drug use. Some tabloids implied reckless behavior. The official investigation pointed to a cabin fire, possibly caused by a malfunctioning heater or cigarette use. The case was closed. But the story wasn't over. Because the more investigators looked, the more cracks appeared. Reports were rushed. Testimonies were inconsistent. Crucial maintenance records were missing. And most disturbing of all, warnings about that aircraft may have been ignored. What the public didn't know at the time was that the plane had a history. Complaints about unsafe conditions, previous fire hazards, a heater system known to be problematic. Multiple opportunities where the aircraft could have been grounded. Instead, it kept flying. And when it finally fell from the sky, the blame landed where it was easiest, to place it on the dead. Ricky Nelson couldn't respond. He couldn't defend himself, and the narrative stuck. But decades later, the truth began to surface. And what it revealed was far worse than an accident. As the years passed, Ricky Nelson's death became frozen in public memory. Another tragic footnote in rock history. Another name added to the list of artists gone too soon. But behind closed doors, those closest to the investigation never fully accepted the official explanation. Slowly, documents emerged. Maintenance logs revealed troubling gaps. Witness statements contradicted official timelines. Aviation experts who reviewed the case years later identified multiple red flags, issues that should have grounded the aircraft long before that final flight. The heater system, widely suspected as the source of the fire, had been flagged previously. Its placement, insulation, and ventilation were all considered dangerous by modern standards, even by the standards of the time. And yet, it remained in service. Even more alarming was evidence suggesting that management and operators were aware of these risks. Repairs were delayed. Inspections were rushed. Cost-cutting took priority over safety. In the aftermath of the crash, attention was quickly diverted. The suggestion that the fire may have been caused by a cigarette, despite little concrete evidence, shifted responsibility away from the aircraft itself. It was a convenient explanation, and it stuck. But experts argue that the speed and intensity of the fire pointed to mechanical failure, not human behavior. A structural fire, not carelessness. So why wasn't that possibility fully pursued? Because accountability would have reached too far. Grounding the aircraft earlier would have cost money. Acknowledging negligence would have triggered lawsuits, and challenging the official narrative would have required powerful institutions to admit fault. Instead, the story was simplified. Ricky Nelson, once America's golden boy, became the silent scapegoat. In death, his image was quietly reshaped, from disciplined professional to reckless relic of a bygone era. And he couldn't stop it. Today, aviation historians agree that the crash was likely preventable, that warnings were ignored, that safer choices were available, and that Ricky Nelson paid the price. This isn't just a story about a plane crash. It's about how systems protect themselves, how narratives are managed, and how truth can be buried when the victim can no longer speak. Ricky Nelson's life wasn't defined by tragedy. It was defined by reinvention, resilience, and quiet integrity. He adapted when fame shifted. He worked when others disappeared. He never stopped performing. And in the end, he trusted a system that failed him. The mystery of Ricky Nelson's death isn't solved because a single clue was uncovered. It's solved because the silence finally broke. Because the pieces finally aligned. And because time removed the need to protect reputations. What remains is an uncomfortable truth. Ricky Nelson didn't die because of excess. He didn't die because of recklessness. He died because safety was compromised, and accountability was avoided. And that is a far more disturbing legacy than anyone was ever meant to see.